In the winter of 1846, a British excavator named Austin Henry Layard was digging through a mound of sun-baked mud in northern Iraq when his workers uncovered a wall of stone slabs taller than a man, carved with figures that seemed to stare directly back at him. Some had the bodies of men and the heads of eagles, others wore horned crowns that marked them as divine, and in their hands, every single one of them held the same two objects, a small woven container in one fist and a strange cone-shaped item in the other, raised toward a stylized tree as if performing some ancient, deliberate ritual. Layard had just rediscovered Nimrud, once the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and he had stumbled onto one of the most reproduced, most argued over, and most misunderstood images in the history of archaeology. Today, it is known online as the Handbag of the Gods, and for the last 2 decades it has been used to argue that ancient Mesopotamian deities carried futuristic technology, that a lost global civilization spanned continents thousands of years before Sumer existed, and that our history books have been hiding the truth. The truth, as it turns out, is stranger and more interesting than the myth, because scholars have spent over a century and a half slowly opening this object up, not with a crowbar, but with clay tablets, comparative art history, and botany. What they found inside changes the story completely. To understand why this image became so explosive, you have to understand what it actually shows. The Assyrian reliefs from sites like Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad depict winged figures, known to scholars as Apkallu, a term borrowed from the Akkadian language, meaning something close to sage or wise one. These figures appear again and again throughout Assyrian palace art, usually flanking doorways, thrones, and a recurring image of a stylized tree made of intersecting bands and palmette fronds, which historians call the sacred tree. In nearly every one of these scenes, the Apkallu figure extends one hand toward the tree holding a cone-shaped object, while the other hand holds a small container down at their side. From certain angles, especially in low-resolution photographs circulated online, that container looks remarkably like a modern handbag, complete with a rigid body and a curved handle arching over the top. It is an uncanny resemblance, and it is the entire foundation of the online mystery. When people saw a 5,000-year-old carving that looked like it was carrying a Chanel bag, the internet did what the internet does, and speculation followed almost immediately. The theory gained momentum because the object did not appear only in Mesopotamia. Similar container shapes, sometimes paired with similar cone or flower shapes, have been identified in reliefs and sculptures from wildly different times and places. At La Venta, an Olmec site on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, a carved stele appears to show a figure holding an object with a comparable silhouette. At Tula, the Toltec capital in central Mexico, colossal warrior statues known as the Atlantes hold items that some observers compare to the Mesopotamian bag. Carvings at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to roughly 9600 BCE and predating Sumerian civilization by thousands of years, include a famous pillar showing a vulture with a circular object near its wing that some writers have folded into the same pattern. Add in a passing resemblance to elements of Egyptian, Polynesian, and even indigenous Australian art, and you have the ingredients for a clay. That has circulated across documentaries, forums, and video essays for more than a decade. That ancient cultures across the entire planet, separated by oceans and millennia, were somehow depicting the exact same object, and that this object represented something beyond the technological capability of any Bronze Age society, evidence of extraterrestrial visitors, a forgotten global civilization, or interdimensional travelers who gifted humanity the arts of civilization. It is worth taking that theory seriously enough to explain it properly, because dismissing an idea without understanding it convinces no one. Proponents of what is generally called the ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized by authors like Erich von Däniken and later expanded by internet communities built around figures such as Zecharia Sitchin, argue that Sumerian mythology itself supports the idea of visiting deities. The Sumerians and their Akkadian and Babylonian successors described a class of divine or semi-divine beings called the Anunnaki, and their creation myths, including the Enuma Elish and fragments describing the god Enki, do talk about gods who created humanity, taught them agriculture, writing, and law, and occasionally traveled between realms. Sitchin's specific claims that the Anunnaki were literal astronauts from a planet called Nibiru, who genetically engineered early. Humans to mine gold are not supported by mainstream Assyriology, and his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts have been directly disputed by scholars who read the original cuneiform, including specialists have pointed out that words he translated as rockets or spacecraft do not carry those meanings in any accepted lexicon of the language. That does not mean the mythology itself is uninteresting. It means the literal, technological reading of it is a modern invention layered on top of stories that meant something very different to the people who first told them. So if the Anunnaki were not astronauts and the handbag was not luggage from another star system, what does the archaeological and textual record actually say? This is where the real detective work begins, and it starts not with speculation, but with language. Because the Assyrians, who carved these reliefs, left behind an enormous archive of their own words describing exactly what these objects were called and what they were used for. The cuneiform texts identify the cone-shaped object using the Akkadian word mulilu, which comes from a root meaning to purify or to cleanse, related to the word elu, meaning clean or holy. The container is called a bandudu, which translates simply and directly as bucket. These are not mysterious, unidentified objects floating without context in the archaeological record. They are named, described, and referenced in ritual texts, and their names tell you their function before you even look at a single image. A purifier and a bucket, held by figures whose entire artistic and religious role, according to inscriptions found alongside them, was to protect and bless. Archaeologists have also found the real, physical, non-carved version of these objects. Excavated bronze and wooden containers from Mesopotamian sites match the proportions and handle shape seen in the reliefs almost exactly. And Assyriologists studying the Nimrud Palace reliefs have noted that platted reed buckets coated in bitumen for waterproofing, a common Mesopotamian construction technique, would have produced precisely the rigid, handled silhouette that online observers later compared to a designer handbag. This is not a coincidence born of It is a coincidence born of function. A container designed to be carried in one hand, filled with liquid, and swung or tipped toward a target, is going to look broadly similar whether it is built in Nimrud in 870 BCE or Milan in 2024, because the physics of carrying and pouring liquid from a handheld vessel has not changed. Human engineering converges on similar shapes when it is solving similar problems, and a rigid-bodied handled bucket is one of the most efficient shapes for that job that exists. Once you know what the objects are named and what they physically were, the next question is what the Apkallu were actually doing with them in front of the sacred tree. And here, scholarship has developed two major, well-supported interpretations that are not mutually exclusive. The first reading, and the older of the two, treats the scene as an act of ritual purification. In this interpretation, the Mululu cone would be dipped into this bandodu bucket, which held water and then shaken or pressed against a person, doorway, throne, or the sacred tree itself to transfer purity and ward off malevolent spirits. This lines up precisely with what we know about Apkallu from Mesopotamian religious texts, particularly the incantation series known as Bit Mizeri, meaning protected house, which describes figurines of these sage-like beings being placed at the entrances of homes and palaces, specifically to guard against demonic intrusion. Reliefs showing Apkallu performing the bucket and cone gesture directly beside. Palace doorways and throne rooms support this reading strongly, since a doorway is exactly where you would want a protective purification ritual performed, sealing the boundary against harm the same way a threshold blessing functions in many other cultures. The second major interpretation, which has gained considerable traction among archaeobotanists and art historians in recent decades, connects the gesture to the practical, economic reality of Assyrian agriculture. The sacred tree itself is widely understood to be a stylized representation of the date palm, which was arguably the single most important economic resource in ancient Mesopotamia, providing food, wood, fiber, and trade goods across the entire region. Date palms require artificial pollination to reliably produce fruit at scale, a technique that involves taking the male flower cluster, which does resemble a small cone or fibrous bundle, and physically transferring its pollen to the female tree, a practice Mesopotamian farmers documented performing by hand, and one that is still carried out by hand in date-growing regions of the Middle East today. Under this reading, the Mululu is not a purifying cone at all, or perhaps carries a double meaning, and the entire scene depicts a divine or symbolic act of pollination, a blessing of fertility and agricultural abundance carried out by protective spirits on behalf of the king, ensuring the continued prosperity of the kingdom's most valuable crop. Some of the most careful recent scholarship on this question has concluded that Assyrian artists may have deliberately layered both meanings into a single gesture, since purification and fertility were not seen as separate religious categories in Mesopotamian thought the way modern viewers might assume, and a single ritual act was capable of carrying multiple sacred meanings simultaneously, reinforcing royal power, agricultural continuity, and spiritual protection all at once. It is worth pausing on just how central the date palm actually was to Assyrian economic life, because that context makes the pollination interpretation far more persuasive than it might sound at first. The banquet stele of Ashur-Nasirpal II, an inscribed sandstone block discovered at Nimrud, describes an enormous festival held to celebrate the completion of his new capital, listing the vast quantities of food and drink served to tens of thousands of guests over 10 days. much of it drawn from the agricultural output of orchards and plantations the king had personally established around the city. Date palms featured prominently among the crops he boasted about cultivating, alongside other fruit trees imported from across his empire, and Assyrian royal inscriptions elsewhere describe kings personally overseeing irrigation canals and orchard management as a demonstration of their fitness to rule, since ensuring agricultural abundance was considered one of the core religious duties of Mesopotamian kingship. Viewed against that backdrop, a repeated image of protective spirits ritually blessing the fertility of the sacred tree stops looking like an isolated decorative flourish and starts looking like a direct visual echo of the king's own stated priorities, carved into the walls of the very palace, where he hosted the festival, celebrating exactly that kind of abundance. Before moving deeper into the scholarly answer, it helps to sit with the scale of what Layard and the excavators who followed him actually found, because the numbers involved are part of why this imagery spread so widely in the first place. The Northwest Palace at Nimrud alone contained several thousand feet of carved gypsum slabs lining its walls, and sister sites at Nineveh and Khorsabad added thousands more, meaning the bucket and cone gesture was not a rare or isolated image, but one of the most frequently repeated compositions in the entire corpus of Assyrian royal art. Many of these slabs were removed in the 19th century and shipped to museums across Europe and North America, which is precisely why a photograph of an Apkallu holding a Bandudu bucket taken at the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Louvre, can now travel across the internet stripped of its original context. Museum labels and accompanying inscriptions, arriving in someone's video essay looking like an unexplained artifact rather than one of the most extensively catalogued and cross-referenced motifs in Near Eastern archaeology. The mystery, in other words, was manufactured largely by decontextualization, not by any genuine gap in the historical record. There's a further layer to this that rarely makes it into the viral versions of the story, which is the identity and mythological role of the Apkallu themselves. According to Mesopotamian tradition, the Apkallu were 7 antediluvian sages sent by the god Enki before a catastrophic flood to bring the foundational arts of civilization to early humanity, including writing, temple building, and law. Later, Assyrian kings, particularly Ashurnasirpal II, who built the palace at Nimrud, where many of these reliefs were found, deliberately surrounded their throne rooms with images of these mythic culture bringers as a form of political theology, visually asserting that the king's rule was protected and legitimized by the same primordial wisdom figures who had civilized humanity in the first place. This is why the imagery repeats obsessively throughout the palace, not because it depicts alien visitation, but because it was propaganda, extremely sophisticated, artistically stunning propaganda, reassuring anyone who walked those halls that the king's power was cosmically sanctioned and spiritually defended. The most famous of these 7 sages was Adapa, sometimes identified with a figure called Oannes in later Greek retellings of Mesopotamian tradition, described as a being who emerged from the sea to teach humanity, writing, mathematics, and the foundations of urban life before returning to the waters each night. It is easy to see why this figure, described in ancient texts as amphibious, superhumanly wise, and directly responsible for gifting civilization to early humans, became a favorite reference point for ancient astronaut theorists looking for evidence of non-human teachers guiding early human development. But the surviving Adapa narrative, preserved in fragments found at Amarna in Egypt and at Nineveh itself, is a story about mortality, divine favor, and a lost opportunity for eternal life, not a technical manual describing a spacecraft or a genetic laboratory. Assyriologists who have spent careers translating this material, including specialists directly responding to Zecharia Sitchin's popular but heavily criticized interpretations, have pointed out repeatedly that the word Sitchin translated as rocket ships, launch platforms, and orbital paths do not carry those meanings in any standard Akkadian or Sumerian lexicon, and that his translations were not accepted or peer-reviewed by the field of Assyriology at any point. This does not mean the myths are worthless or uninteresting once the reading is set aside. It means they need to be read as what they are, some of the oldest surviving religious literature on Earth, written by a society trying to explain its own origins, its relationship to flood and catastrophe, and the source of its own knowledge, using the conceptual tools available to Bronze Age priests and scribes, rather than the conceptual tools of 20th century science fiction. Now, what about the claim that traveled the furthest and generated the most excitement? The idea that the exact same handbag appears identically across cultures that had no contact with one another, from Mesopotamia to Mexico to Turkey to the Pacific. This is worth addressing directly and honestly because it is the load-bearing pillar of the entire theory, and it deserves a careful, unemotional look rather than either blind acceptance or dismissive mockery. It is true that container shapes with a rigid body and an arched handle appear in art from multiple, geographically separated ancient cultures. It is also true, and this is the part that gets lost, that a handled container is one of the simplest and most universally useful objects a human society can invent, right alongside the wheel, the axe, and the woven basket. Every agricultural society on Earth needed to carry liquids and solids by hand, and a rigid vessel with an arched handle solves that problem in the most structurally efficient way physics allows, whether you are in Bronze Age Iraq, classical Mesoamerica, or Neolithic Anatolia. Archaeologists refer to this kind of pattern as independent invention or convergent design, the same phenomenon that explains why pyramids appear on multiple continents without any evidence of contact, why boat and arrow technology developed independently on nearly every inhabited continent, and why pottery, weaving, and basketry emerged again and again in unconnected societies. A shared solution to a shared problem is not evidence of a shared origin. It is evidence that human beings, whether in Sumer or in the Yucatan, are remarkably good at solving the same practical problems in remarkably similar ways. It is also worth being precise about what the Göbekli Tepe comparison actually shows, since it is frequently cited as the oldest example of the motif, and treated as if it settles the debate. The pillar in question does include a rounded object near a carved bird figure, and some writers have interpreted it as an early handbag. But Göbekli Tepe predates Sumerian civilization by roughly 6,000 years, comes from an entirely different cultural and religious context that researchers are still working to understand, and the object in question has also been interpreted by specialists working on the site as a solar disk, a decorative element or part of the bird's own anatomy rather than a carried container at all, treating a heavily debated, ambiguous carving from one of the least understood sites in archaeology as confirmed proof of a 6,000-year continuity with a specific, well-documented Assyrian ritual bucket is not a conclusion supported by the evidence. It is a resemblance stretched across an enormous gap of time, geography, and cultural context to make two unrelated things look like one continuous story. The Mesoamerican comparisons deserve the same careful treatment rather than a blanket dismissal, because the Olmec, Toltec, and later Aztec civilizations that produced the La Venta Stele and the Atlantes of Tula developed their own extraordinarily rich traditions of depicting deities and rulers holding ritual implements, bags, and bundles tied to their own cosmology, agricultural cycles, and bloodletting rites, thousands of miles from Mesopotamia and with no archaeological evidence of transoceanic contact between the two regions during the relevant time periods. Mesoamerican iconography includes ritual bundles associated with royal accession and sacred fire ceremonies that share a broad visual category with the Assyrian bandudu, a handled container carried by a sacred figure without sharing the specific religious content, the specific deity, or the specific ritual. Purpose behind it. Comparative religion? Scholars have long recognized that a shared visual grammar, a bag here, a cone, or bundle there, tends to emerge naturally wherever societies develop formal religious iconography around priestly or royal ritual, simply because there are only so many ways to visually represent a person performing a ceremonial act, with an object in each hand. The same caution applies to the so-called wristwatch, another detail frequently paired with the handbag claim, pointing to bracelet-like bands on the wrists of these carved figures as evidence of technological instruments. Bracelets, armbands, and wrist ornamentation are extraordinarily common across nearly every ancient civilization for which we have art or physical remains worn by royalty, priests, and elites as markers of status, and often loaded with religious symbolism of their own. Assyrian reliefs consistently depict kings, courtiers, and divine attendants wearing elaborate rosette bracelets, and excavated examples of the actual jewelry survive in museum collections today, made of gold, bronze, and semi-precious stone with no mechanical components, no hands, no dials, nothing. Resembling a timekeeping device beyond the basic fact that a circular band worn on the wrist will always superficially resemble a watch to a modern eye conditioned to see one there. This is less a mystery than a demonstration of a very human cognitive habit called pattern projection, where the brain, presented with an ambiguous shape, reaches for the most familiar object in its own recent experience to explain it, which is exactly why a Bronze Age purification bucket becomes a designer handbag and a ceremonial bracelet becomes a wristwatch in a viral video, but a woven basket and a piece of jewelry in a peer-reviewed journal. None of this means the reliefs are boring or that the mystery surrounding them was manufactured out of nothing. The real story is arguably more impressive than the manufactured one because it did not require ancient astronauts to be extraordinary. It required an empire capable of organizing vets, a labor, resources, and artistic skill to carve tens of thousands of square feet of gypsum alabaster with imagery precise enough that we can still identify individual plant species and ritual gestures within it nearly 3,000 years later. It required a religious and political system sophisticated enough to encode multiple layers of meaning, protection, fertility, legitimacy, and cosmic order into a single repeated gesture performed by hybrid sage spirits at every threshold of the king's palace. And it required generations of modern scholars, starting with excavators like Layard in the 1840s and continuing through today's Assyriologists, art historians, and archaeobotanists, patiently cross-referencing thousands of cuneiform tablets against thousands of carved images to reconstruct a belief system that had been silent for over 2,500 years. That is the actual act of opening the handbag. It did not happen in a single drama. Tick, reveal. It happened slowly, tablet by tablet, relief by relief, translation by translation, as scholars matched the Akkadian word bandudu to a bucket, matched mululu to a purifying cone, matched the incantation series bit mazeri to the protective role of the apkalu, and matched the stylized tree to the economic backbone of an empire bee, hilt on dates. Every piece of that puzzle had to be found separately in different excavations, different archives, and different decades of research before the full picture could be assembled. There's a broader lesson buried inside this particular controversy, one that applies well beyond Mesopotamian art. Ancient civilizations are routinely underestimated by exactly the kind of theory that claims to be honoring them, saying that the Assyrians could not possibly have produced such precise, symbolically dense, cross-referenced religious art on their own, that it must have come from an external, more advanced source, is not actually a compliment to ancient Assyria. It erases the genuine intellectual and artistic achievement of a Bronze and Iron Age civilization that developed writing, law codes, monumental architecture, hydraulic engineering, and one of the most administratively complex empires of the ancient world, entirely through human effort, observation, and cultural transmission across many centuries. The people who carved the Nimrud reliefs were not passive, recipients of borrowed alien knowledge. They were sophisticated theologians, engineers, and artists who built an entire visual language capable of expressing ideas about purity, fertility, protection, and kingship, and encoded it so precisely that we can still partially decode it thousands of years later using nothing but their own words, preserved in clay. That is not a lesser story than the ancient astronaut version. It is the more remarkable one, because every part of it is real, verifiable, and entirely human. So the next time you see a carved figure from Nimrud or Nineveh described online as proof of extraterrestrial contact, holding a handbag that should not exist, and wearing a wristwatch that predates modern timekeeping by 3,000 years, you will know what you're actually looking at. You're looking at a bucket of water and a cone of pollen, or perhaps both at once, carried by a mythological sage meant to guard a doorway and bless a date palm, wrapped in a story so visually striking that it has fooled millions of casual viewers into mistaking Bronze Age ritual craftsmanship for lost technology. The mystery was never really about handbags. It was about how quickly a genuinely fascinating piece of ancient religious art can be flattened into something simpler and stranger the moment nobody bothers to read the label the ancient artists themselves left behind. Assyriologists opened that label a long time ago. It just took the rest of us a little longer to notice. If this deep dive into one of history's most misunderstood images taught you something new, give this video a thumbs up so more people can see the real story behind the headlines. Subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want more videos that separate ancient mystery from ancient fact, drop a comment below telling me which supposedly unexplainable artifact you want investigated next, and share this with the one friend who is absolutely convinced the pyramids were built by aliens. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.